and just copy and paste the exact same method definition twice. Notice on the second definition I get an error. Let me hover my mouse cursor over so you can see it. Type program, so that's the class program, already defines a member called display result with the same parameter types. So you can create additional versions of the same method with the same name, but they have to have a different method signature. A method signature is the number and the data type of the input parameters in your method definition. So in this case, I already have a method called display result with 3 strings. I could change these names to just any old, gobbledygook text there, and I still get an error. It's the same problem because the fundamental fact that we've not changed the signature of the method means that I'm still having the same problem. However, I could change this by allowing only a single message or a single string to be input as an input parameter, and now I have 2 completely different versions of the method as far as C# is concerned. Now in this case, I wouldn't need any of this. I'd probably just do this. Like so. And then I could call it by doing this. Basically what I was trying to avoid last time, but we'll go ahead and do it anyway. Okay, so this time we're passing in one long string. Notice the use of the concatenation operator and the use of some empty spaces defined by 2 double quotes with just an empty space in between. And so we should have 2 lines that display essentially the same thing. Here, let's make sure we do this right. We'll add a right line in between them just to make sure there's a break. All right, so bottom Tabor. And so we get 2 results that look identical. Now, you might wonder, why are we doing this? Why in the world would you ever want to create 2 methods with the exact same name that essentially do the same thing but allow the user to pass in different information? And let me give you a good example of why you might want to do that is with the console.writeLine. So here we go with console.writeLine. Have you ever noticed as you type the opening parenthesis for the method invocation operator that there's a little message that pops up down there that there's 1 of 19, and then you look to the right of it, and as I use the arrow keys on my keyboard and go up and down, notice that the number goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, these are all the different data types that the WriteLine method will accept. So it'll accept an input parameter of type Boolean, which is true, false. It'll accept a single character or an array of characters. It'll accept a decimal value, which is usually used for money, or a double, which is used for longer mathematical calculations, or a float, which is a massive number in terms of the number of values after the decimal point. It allows you to pass in an integer and other types of integer style values. It allows you to pass in a string and then others as well. 19 different versions of console.writeLine to make it convenient for the user of the application to utilize that method in their app, okay? For the developer of the application to use it in their app. So now when we go to display result, we'll see the same thing in IntelliSense, display result, and notice that I have 2 versions. I'm looking at version 1 of 2, and notice the emphasis on the input parameter. That the first version accepts 1 input parameter of type string called message, and then the second version accepts 3 input parameters of type string, reverse last name, and reverse city. Okay, so there you go. That is why you would create overloaded versions of your methods. All right. Now, in this case, notice that we could eliminate so much of the code from this in order to essentially get the same working results. So I'll just delete that. And, you know, for the sake of simplicity, I'll go ahead and remove this as well. And so now we've reduced down the amount of code dramatically for our application and improved the flexibility of our application by adding multiple ways to actually display the results. Okay, so at Developer University, I issue a decree to students that no method should have more than 6 lines of code in it. If it has more than 6 lines of code in it, then it's probably attempting to do too much in the system. You should be able, again, to express what it's doing in English, and then if you find yourself saying it does this and that, then it's probably an opportunity to split those up into multiple methods. Of course, rules are meant to be broken, and as a rule of thumb, 6 lines of code per method will keep your code tidy and readable. It'll keep everything scoped nice and very tightly, and it'll improve the quality of your code dramatically. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about methods, but we're going to be using them from this point on. So if there's anything about this that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, by all means, please make sure that you watch this lesson again or seek out some other resources. Okay? You're doing great. Let's continue on. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, we're going to look at another iteration statement, the while iteration statement. And let's just recap the iteration statements we've learned about up to this point. We learned about the for loop, or the for iteration statement, and it allowed us to iterate through a block of code a number of preset times based on a counter. Then we also learned about the for each iteration statement that allowed us to iterate through a block of code once per item in an array. Now, in both of these cases, you know ahead of time how many iterations or how many times to iterate through the given block of code. But what if you didn't know up front how many times that you needed to iterate? Maybe you need to keep iterating until some condition is met. In that case, you'll want to use the while iteration statement. Also, we'll take a look at the do while iteration statement, which allows us to always iterate at least one time before breaking out of the iteration statement. So we'll look at both of them in this lesson. And I'm trying to think of use cases where this would be useful. And the most obvious one to me was creating some sort of little menu system for our console window application. You've seen them before, especially if you've worked with DOS in the past. At any rate, what we want to do is begin with a new project. You can see I've already created it. It's called while iteration. Again, another console window application. Please pause the video. Catch up with me. When you're ready, let's go ahead and get started by creating a method that will print out a list of options to our users in the form of a menu. So we'll do something like this. Alright, so we have some more work to do here, but what we want to do is display this. So let's just start by displaying the main menu here, like so, and let's run the application. And here we can choose an option. No matter what we choose at this point, our display will disappear. But suppose that we wanted to actually kick off another feature of our application. So say, for example, let's go private static void print numbers, and then we'll go private static void guessing game like this, and it will just go console.write line. Alright, and so now let's go ahead and call those from here. So print numbers and then guessing game. Alright, so now let's run the application, and we choose the first option and we're able to play the print numbers game. But when I hit enter, we are completely removed from the application. What if I wanted to return back to that main menu? How could I go about that? Well, I could use a while statement to determine whether to show the menu again or to completely exit out of the application. So to make this work, what I'm going to do is start off with a new data type called bool. Referred to it briefly a moment ago. It's basically true or false, all right? And so we want to create a new Boolean variable called display menu, and we'll set its initial value equal to true. Now what we'll do is create a while statement. I'll just type in while tab, and what I'll say is while the display menu equals true, all right, and then we will call display menu. Now, a couple things here. What we'll need to do is actually then retrieve back from main menu a Boolean whether the user clicked exit or not. So what we'll set is display menu equals main menu, and then have main menu return a bool itself. Of course, we've completely broken the application at this point, but that's okay. So here we are going to continue to display the main menu until main menu returns the value false. So if somebody chooses option number 3 to exit, then we might choose to completely exit the application, in which case we'll return false. Now if they choose some other option like 4, 5, 6 or some other text option, then we might just want to redisplay the menu, so we'll return true again. Furthermore, we might want to return true as well here after we go through each of these options as well. So now let's go ahead and run the application and see how it works this time. All right. First of all, if we choose option number 1, it'll display a message, and after we hit the enter key on the keyboard, it will display the menu again. And I can select number 2, and it'll display the message, and then I can hit enter, and now we can hit the exit, and we actually exit out of the application. So what the while statement allowed us to do in this case is check for a condition, and when that condition is true, then we can break out of the while loop. Otherwise, we're going to keep executing the code inside of our code block. All right. Now, what we can do here is actually shorten this up a little bit. We don't need to say while display menu equals true. Remember that we're, just like when we're using the if statement or the else if, we want to evaluate an expression, and if an expression is true, then we want to either execute that block of code below it or not. In this case, if display menu is already true or if it's false, we don't need to actually do this evaluation. It already evaluates to true or false, so we don't have to do any equality there or check for equality. It's either true or it's false, and so we can just write it like that very simply. All right. So moving on. Now what we want to do is kind of maybe fill in the gap on some of these other little games we have here. So let's play the print the numbers game. And in order to do that, let's go ahead and say console.write, type a number, and then int result equals console.readline. All right, and that's going to return back a string, but what we really want is an integer. So I'm going to go int.integer.parse, and this will allow us to take whatever string has been returned and convert it into an integer. Now we should have the actual integer value. And here what we'll do is create a counter for ourselves. So int counter equals 1, and then we'll go while tab the counter is less than our result. Then we will do a console.write with the current value counter. We'll go console.write, and we'll do a little delimiter, and then we'll do we'll increase the counter. Now there's a tiny bug with the application. We will come back to that in just a moment here. But let's go ahead and run the application, and let's go ahead and type in a number. Let's type in the number 5, and it types in, and it will print out the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're able to change the number of times on the fly that will iterate through a block of code. Now it just so happens that this isn't exactly what we wanted, and let me exit out of this. What we really wanted was to display from 1 to 5. So I'm going to go ahead and add result plus 1. So if I typed in the number 5, this would actually make this value 6. So as long as we're less than 6, go ahead and continue to execute these lines of code. But once this statement becomes false, once the counter is no longer less than 6, if it's equal to 6, it will break out, and we'll hit this line of code here in line number 59, the console.readline. Okay? So that should work. Now the other thing that I noticed when we ran the application is that we keep seeing additional data being written to the window. I might want to clear out everything that's been displayed so far. So here we'll start at the top and do console.clear, and that should clear off the screen for us. And I'll just copy and paste that here to print numbers as well. So when we run the application again, this time I'm going to choose option number 1, and notice that it cleared off the screen, and we're in the print numbers game. I'm going to type a number, type the number, let's go 4. It types out 1, 2, 3, 4. I hit enter, it clears that off, and it displays the menu again. Awesome. 3. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is play the guessing game, and again here I'm going to go ahead and clear off everything that's currently on the screen, and what I want to do is choose a random number, and then I'm going to allow the end user who's playing the game to try and guess the number between 1 and 10. So how do I create a random number in C#? We actually use this built-in class in the .NET Framework class library called the random class. So we'll create a new instance of the random class, and we'll talk about what that means, create an instance of a class in an upcoming lesson. So let me do this. We'll go random, my random equals new random. And again, that should make no sense to you whatsoever, and that's just fine. I'll explain what that actually did in an upcoming lesson when we talk about classes, okay? And I want to get a random number from my random class. So I'm going to call the next method, and here one of the overloaded versions is that I get to give it a minimum value and a maximum value. So the minimum value will be 1, but the maximum value I want it to be 10, so I'm going to say don't let it be more than 10. In other words, 11 is out of bounds, okay? Now that I have a random number, I'm going to also keep track of how many guesses the player has guessed up to this point. All right. Then I want to also keep track of whether or not the user was correct or not. So incorrect, and we're going to say it is true that they were incorrect. Now watch this. I'm going to create a do while statement. I want the block of code that I'm going to create to execute at least one time. So that's why I'm going to choose the do as opposed to the the do while as opposed to the while. The while will evaluate the very first time, and we may never actually run the code inside of our code block. But this time I wanted to run it at least one time, so we'll say do this, but then at the very end we'll check for the statement while, and if the while condition is true, then we can break out of it. Okay, so while we continue to be incorrect is true. So while we continue to be incorrect, then we're going to keep guessing. All right, so let's start with this console.writeLine, and we'll say guess a number between 1 and 10. All right, and so we want to retrieve that number. So we'll go string result equals console.readLine, like so. All right, now that we have it, we can do an evaluation. So if the result is equal to the random number, so if whatever the user typed in is equal to the random number that we generated, then we want to break out of the while statement, so we're no longer incorrect. So in other words, let's go ahead and set incorrect equal to false. So at this point, we've guessed correctly, and we'll break out of the while statement, and here we would want to say console.writeLine, hey, you did it correct. All right. However, if they did not guess correctly, then what we would want to do is write console.writeLine and then wrong, and we'd probably want them to guess again, which will happen because while incorrect is still true, then we'll come and we'll re-execute this block of code. Looks like I'm missing a end-of-line character here. I can see that as I hover my mouse cursor over that little red area that I forgot a semicolon there. Otherwise, this should work. Now, there's one other thing that I want to do. I want to keep track of the number of guesses. So each time the user adds a guess, we've already initialized that value there, that variable guesses. I'm going to increase guesses or increment guesses by 1. So I type in the word guesses plus plus. That means I want to add 1 to the current value of guesses. And then here I want to type out how many times it took. So it took guesses. It took you guesses. And then we'll do that, like so. All right. Let's run the application. And let's choose to guess a number between 1 and 10. We'll start off at 3. And you can see it says it's wrong, so I could continue to guess a number between 1 and 10. Let's go 4. Let's go 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, the number was 8. It took me 6 guesses to get to that. All right. So now when I hit enter, it returns me back to my main menu. And here I'll just hit 3 to exit. And let's go ahead and change our menu at this point. Let's just do print numbers and then the guessing game. All right, and so we've used the while statement in a couple of capacities. The while statement here is used so that we can continue to display the menu until the user decides to exit. We are using it to merely print out values to a screen, but we get to determine it at runtime, or let the user determine it at runtime, as opposed to the for or the for each, where it's kind of predetermined ahead of time. And then finally, we're able to use the do while to continue to ask a series of questions until we get a satisfactory answer, at which point then we can break out of the loop. The do variation allows us to run our code block at least one time as opposed to immediately jumping outside of the block if the condition is true. Okay? So that's why we would use the while iteration statement. It's pretty useful in certain cases. And so let's continue on. We'll learn about strings in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devview.com. Now, many of the types of applications that you'll build as a C# developer will require you to work with text, whether you're formatting the text for display to the end user or whether you're manipulating the text in some way. Like a good example would be whenever you are massaging data. And that's a term that developers use to talk about taking data from a file or a database and it's in some raw form and you need to manipulate it. You need to remove certain characters, you need to add certain characters in certain positions in order to get it and prepare it for ingestion to be used by some other software system or to be saved in a different file format, whatever the case might be. So manipulating data is a key skill, whether for display or for the sake of massaging data into the right format. Furthermore, whenever you're working with the string data type, you're working with a data type that can hold a lot of information. So to extend the bucket analogy, you're working with a really big bucket. And when you're working with big buckets, you have the responsibility of working with them in an efficient way, because when you're working with data that takes up a lot of memory, it requires a lot of processing power. You are putting a strain on system resources. Now, admittedly, it would take a lot of string manipulation to slow down a computer, especially a modern computer. However, as software developers, we want to do things efficiently, and so it's important to understand that there are tools in the .NET Framework class library that will help us work with and manipulate strings in a very efficient way. So that's really the purpose of this lesson, to show you how to perform some simple string manipulations, like inserting special characters into your literal strings, formatting strings, especially numbers and dates and things of that nature, manipulating strings, changing things about strings, searching for items and removing them or replacing them with something else in strings, and then also working with strings in a more efficient way. So as you can see, I've already taken the liberty of setting up a new console window project called Working with Strings. Please take a moment, pause the video, and catch up with me. And I've already added 3 lines of code that we'll use to demonstrate some key manipulations for our strings. And so what I'll wind up doing is just typing in a string and then showing you some manipulation and then moving on to the next line. But at any rate, let's go ahead and start by talking about the special nature of the backslash character, which is that character there. I always used to get my characters confused. That's forward slash, that's backslash, okay? So a backslash character can be used to escape or insert escape sequences into literal strings. This will allow us to do things like put special characters, insert line feeds, and things into a literal string. So for a good example of this, what if I wanted to type something ironic like my so-called life, right? And I wanted to insert a series of double quotes around the word so-called so that it displays the way that I would, as the author of this, expected to be displayed on screen. Now, unfortunately, you can see that the Visual Studio, on behalf of the C# compiler, doesn't like this at all. It thinks that you have 2 literal strings here, the word my and life, and in between something that it can make no sense of whatsoever, the word so, or the term so, a minus symbol, and then the word called. These are not variables that have been declared. It doesn't recognize them as keywords. So C# does not like this. In order to insert a special character like a double quote to say, I don't want this to delineate a literal string, I want to use this inside of my literal string, I'll use the backslash character before each double quote, which escapes out the double quote and makes it available for use inside of the literal string itself. So now when we run the application, we can get double quotes inside of our string. Okay? Now, similarly, let's go ahead and my string equals, and I tell you what, I'm just going to copy this to my clipboard so I can keep using it. All right, so now what if I needed to add a new line? So what if I need a new line? And I want to split this up onto 2 separate lines in my application. What I can do is insert a new line character. So think of a line feed /n will create a line feed. And let's go ahead and run the application, and you can see that it's smart enough to know that even though we didn't separate with spaces around the word and new, it was still able to